Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar from Vamos Expeditions. I hope you and your families are all very healthy and good. We are excited to see people from around the world joining us. We want to give welcome to all the travel agents that are present today, students, guides, and everyone that is willing to learn something new about the Peruvian cultures. Our webinar today will be 45 minutes presentations, and afterwards we'll have like 15 minutes to answer your questions that you can leave in the comment boxes. In a bit, I'm going to present Samantha Encalada from the Museum Larco in Lima. We always highly recommend to visit this beautiful museum when you have the time in Lima because it's incredible, and they have a fascinating collection of gold, silver, pottery, also textiles. Some of them are made with feathers. They also have an interesting collection of erotic pottery. And it's just a very beautiful place to visit as well. It's like a quiet oasis in the middle of the city with beautiful gardens. So, well, highly recommended. Samantha has a background in archaeology and she's passionate about tourism as well. So let's hear from her and enjoy the ride.
Thank you so much, Annalise, and thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today. As Annalise said, my name is Samantha. I'm the head of institutional affairs at Museo Larco, and I'm very, very excited, very happy to be here. Hopefully everyone is doing well despite the circumstances right now. And this is just a small webinar to show you a little bit of the background of Peruvian archaeology, but specifically the intimate bond with nature that ancient Peruvians had. And hopefully this will get you going to start exploring more about Peru and hopefully come soon. So I'm gonna present right now, and Elisa, I'm just going to ask you to see if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see it, Samantha. Go ahead.
Great. Well, so this is Museo del Arco. To those of you who don't know it, it's not so little, but it is quite small. It's a museum that is in Lima, Peru. Even though it's quite small, as in you can probably do a tour in around an hour and a half or so. We do have 45,000 pieces of ancient Peruvian artifacts, which is amazing. And of course, Annalise mentioned the gardens, which we absolutely love. As I mentioned, this is just a little introduction to the bond with nature that ancient Peruvians had, and in general, ancient civilizations, because I'm gonna mention Peru, because of course the webinar is about this, but I just want you to reflect on the fact that ancient civilizations used to have this way of seeing the world that is quite different from ours right now. And I think that that it's a way that we can all get back into that mindset. But let's start from the beginning. I'm just going to give a little bit of a background of the history. And the history of Peru, of course, to most people, kind of starts with the Incas. But if you see the dates that you have here, the Incas only were an empire for about 100 years, which is not that long. And Peru's history is definitely older than that. But why are the Incas so popular? It's because of the Spanish, and not just because of the Conquista. The Conquista brought processes into ancient Peru, which means that the Spanish people, when they arrived here, what they saw was the Inca Empire, and so they wrote chronicles about it. That went on for centuries, really. Those chronicles were written here in Spanish about the Inca traditions and the customs and their way of life, their way of seeing the world, which we're going to talk about in a bit, the Andean cosmovision, as we like to call it. And those chronicles, what they did is they traveled all the way back to Europe, and so the rest of the world were able to see what the Incas were about. And that kind of happened throughout the centuries. So it wasn't until the beginning of Peruvian archaeology, which happened it's quite young. It just happened quite recently in the 20th century. It wasn't until then that we realized that Peru's history went far beyond the Incas. So now we call it pre-Columbian history, not just Incan history. So once archaeological excavations and investigations started to happen, our way of seeing history changed, because we used to see the Conquista as the last stage before Peru's independence and the Incas before them. And then we started to realize there were so many other cultures that existed before that. And not just in Cusco as a center, but in different regions and in different places with a lot of very distinct life styles. So we're not just seeing different types of architecture, but we're also seeing different types of pottery and of monuments and different artifacts too. All in all, we discovered, as of today, that we have over 8,000 years of history. We are one of the oldest civilizations in the world. There's a name for that. We call it the cradles of civilization. Now, you probably know some other cradles of civilization from around the world that are a little bit more popular, a little bit more known than Peru. And that would be Egypt, and Mesopotamia, India, China. You have Mesoamerica as part of the Americas, and now you have Peru. It was only 25 years ago that we kind of started discovering these things. So it is a lot to investigate. It is a lot to keep discovering, and it's still going on. Archaeology in Peru is very, very young, and we're very fortunate that we live in a time where we are still discovering more cultures and more monuments. Added to that diversity that we have, because imagine all of the different cultures that existed before the Incas, all the way till the Incas in different regions of Peru, we also have the fact that Peru, as when it comes to biodiversity, is one of the most biodiverse places in the world. It has 84 out of 117 life zones. So we're talking different altitudes, because for example, here where Museo del Arco is in Lima, we're in the coast. But then you go all the way to the Andes, where you can reach up to 4,000 meters above the sea level. You can go to the rainforest, and you will have different climates, but not just different climates and altitudes. That really translates to more than that, because you also start seeing different cultures. Their environment, the fruits, the vegetables, the animals are all going to be different from region to region, from altitude to altitude, from temperature to temperature. And that's going to shape the world of the people who inhabited those places. And that's going to end up translating to different styles and different ways of seeing the world. But I'm not here to talk about just how different it all is. I'm going to talk about what unifies all of these cultures, so you can understand all of them a little bit better. And that's the way of seeing the world. The Andean cosmovision, as we say it, is just the way that ancient Peruvians had of seeing the world. And their world was so different from us that we kind of need to have a little bit of an introduction to see how they thought, in order to understand the objects that they made and the objects that eventually, hopefully, you will see at the museum. So this is us. As much as we like it or not, we live in a consumer society. We buy things that we don't produce directly, right? If I want to get fruits or vegetables, I don't have to handle the earth myself, right? I don't have to grow those things from my own earth. I just go to the supermarket, or I go to the store, and I get them and I eat them. So that's what a consumer society is. We constantly buy things instead of producing them directly. Now think about 5,000 years ago. All over the world, factories didn't exist, stores didn't exist, supermarkets didn't exist. The way that they saw the world was through an agricultural society. And that's a whole different way of seeing the world, because it means that every single thing that exists in your environment is going to shape what you eat, whether you survive or not, where you're going to settle, what you're going to do. And how your religions look, how your traditions look, how your societies look. So agricultural societies are going to be shaped all around the world. And here in Peru specifically, we have this concept of life that is constantly spiraling. It's kind of like a spiral, and that's why a lot of our objects have a lot of spirals as a motive. It is constant, it is always flowing, it is always cyclical, because I mean, for us, it's we know that it's the middle of the autumn for us. For all of you in the northern hemisphere, you are you're going into the spring, but we know what the next season is going to look like, and we know what the next one is going to be, and we know what the next one is going to be. And that existed before too. So that's the one thing that we have in common with them, our climate and our environment. We know what the weather is. And if that changes, it's going to change a lot of things in our lives. But 5,000 years ago, it changed everything. So they need to keep a life that is constantly cyclical and never ending, because life is never ending, really. We just it's kind of like a tree that kind of dies, but then something else is going to come in replacement of it, and life is going to keep going generation after generation. That is what the nature looks like. That is what nature is. And so out of that, if you already understand that, then you'll be able to understand that the world is different for people who survive on agricultural reasons, because you have an earth that has to support you, and then there's you, and then there's the sky, the world above. We call it the Hanan Pacha, where the sun is, where the moon is, where the stars are, where they can shape us, and we can see in the stars in which season we are, how the weather is going to look like. It's going to shape everything for our agricultural cycle to continue on. So naturally, that's where the gods are going to be. Those are those entities, whether it's the sun itself or an invisible entity that is in the sky, is going to turn into a god or different gods that control our way of living. So that's the world above. Now, we also talk about expressions, right? So I'm not just going to tell you the abstract concept of the Hanan Pacha, but the symbol. So the symbol naturally is going to be a bird. So get ready for some very special animals that are going to be shaping, and they're going to be symbols of these worlds and of these expressions that are going to be expressing the Andean cosmovision. So it's not just going to be all kinds of birds. It's always going to depend on the region. It's always going to depend on the area, of course, but it's usually going to be very strong predators, usually predator birds. And that makes sense, right? Because the Hanan Pacha, as they see it, has a lot of power. So we need to represent it with an equally powerful animal. Now you have the underworld, the world below, the Ukupacha. That's the world that we don't see, as opposed to really the Hanan Pacha, which is very visible. It's out there, it's the sky, you can look at it, you can see the things that are going on, but you don't see anything that is going on in the Ukupacha. So it's underneath the earth, it's dark. It's kind of like a womb too, because as an agriculturer, you put the seed inside of the earth and life is going to start. So that's where life really continues on. And that's where we bury our dead too, which is amazing, because that means that in most ancient civilizations, you bury the dead, but you don't think that life ends there. So what we have here, for example, are the dead joining in a ritual underneath the earth in the Ukupacha. Because of course, if you're putting a seed and life is going to grow out of it, why doesn't the same thing happens to the dead? And we don't call them the dead either. We call them ancestors. They're the ones that are protecting us too. And we give them rights and we give them gifts when we bury them. so they can help us continue that spiral of life. That is represented by a snake. Usually a snake, sometimes some other reptiles, but that's going to be the symbol. Again, very naturally visual representation of the ukupacha. That shape too, it kind of reminds us, right, of the constant going of the life, which I find it so interesting that they would do that. And the snake specifically, they change skin, so it's also quite nice because it talks a lot about regeneration. And then we have us. We don't call it this world, we just call it the world of now, where we are at right now. And we have some sort of power because we are the ones who are trying to join into those two other opposed worlds, and we're trying to join them, kind of like in the middle of a sandwich. That's us, the humans. Humans have structures, we have societies, so it's always going to be the most powerful of us that are able to connect those two worlds, be it priests or emperors, however you want to call it, even the Inca himself later on. And they are going to adopt some powers. So the animal that represents the world of now has to be powerful too. I'm sure you can guess it because there are some other representations in some other civilizations. We didn't have lions, we didn't have tigers, but we did have pumas and jaguars. So those are going to be the two big felines that are going to be representing the world of now, our power as human beings in this society, trying to join these two opposing worlds in order to continue the spiral of life. And you can see a representation here, just to give you a little example. So if you notice the pottery vessel at the back has the fangs of the feline. And then you have the middle one with the little, with the head made out of the bird heads. And then you have the one in the front that is no longer, it is a human, but it's an ancestor, if you can notice that. And it also has the fangs of a feline. So we're getting into the really the union of all of these objects, because the animals represent the power of those worlds. So if you join them, it means that you're joining those worlds, right? But let's not talk about that right now. Let's keep going about the union of everything. So the union of everything is going to be represented by the stairs, of course, because you use them to move on or move up or down. And if you can see the beginning of the spiral there, that's also a nice touch. It's a nice little detail of how life continues. So you have Hanan Pacha, Kai Pacha, Uku Pacha, represented by the bird, the feline, and the snake. And those three are going to join together, continue on with our life, and really make our survival happen. And then there's unions. Then there's unions of those three worlds, which I have already mentioned, but just to give you it's such a nice example with this artifact, because it's a vessel that if you see it from one side, you'll be able to recognize the fangs, right? The fangs of the feline. At the one side, you can definitely see the eye, because it's the only one that it's kind of turquoise. But through the other side, instead of seeing the ear of the feline, you'll probably end up seeing a beak. And it works both ways too. When you see it looking at the right, you'll see the feline with the claws, but to the other side, you'll see a bird flying. And then you have, of course, the snakes represented in the spirals that come on top and underneath, and the stairs too. So that's a nice little union. So you can have an example of how that's represented in ancient Peruvian art. I've already talked about the concept of the union, but it's really important, and especially because this is about the bond with nature. What we need to understand in order to understand ancient Peru is that duality needs to exist in order for life to exist. Without opposing objects that are complementary, we won't be able to unify them and have life. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the day and the night, the sun and the moon, the light and the darkness, dry and wet, masculine, feminine. All of those are two opposing concepts that really complement each other and create life. And we need them. We need them in order to survive. We need them in order to make life. So, for example, when translated to objects, we are talking about, as you saw before, those two colors that are opposing, that are very, very side to side, completely separated but unified in a single artifact. And this one is especially nice because it's gold and silver. Gold and silver have a different shine to them. They shine like the sun and the moon, and so together they are very powerful. But you'll see it later in our collection for metal work. And then you have, again, the spiral of life, represented again in gold and objects. Now, it's also important to understand that these artifacts, they aren't really from a museum, right? People wore them. People had to use them in order to give them power, or they had to give them to their ancestors in order to give them power. So these aren't just abstract concepts. These are things that people took and people wore and people used in order to create their importance, in order to pass along the message. Another example of this is, for example, just a mask, a funerary mask, with the fangs of a feline again. Okay, so now I'm just going to pass along another example so you can really start taking into consideration everything that I've mentioned before, which is, I mean, this is definitely one of our masterpieces at the museum. It's completely made out of gold, and this is what I mentioned when I say that people use them. People had to use them in order to give these symbols power, because there is such an intimate bond with nature that we wouldn't be able to understand if we didn't understand the objects. But it's not just about seeing the objects, because these objects can be very beautiful, but you need to understand the why behind it all. And that's our job at the museum, to really give you the why. And for you to keep asking why whenever you see it, because it's not just about the objects. It's not just about the exhibition rooms. It's not about the museums that you see here. It's not only about the artifacts, it's also about the places. For example, if you go to Machu Picchu, you'll see that it's such a beautiful place in itself. But if you understand the why behind it, there's a different and very intimate experience that you have as a visitor of that place when you understand its importance from way, way back, as opposed to just seeing how beautiful it is. That's the goal that we have. So this was just really a very small introduction, because I mean, this is the storage area of the museum, and it's just a very, very small piece of information that I've just given you. There's so much else to explore. There's so much to see. There are so many cultures that you can experience here, and all of them have their own little styles. They're quite different from one another. As long as you understand the underlying issue, the Andean cosmovision that shaped them, that made them do the things that they did, you will have it all covered. But you will still want to see more. That's the goal. That you come here, you introduced to ancient Peruvian history, the bond that they had with nature, how they expressed themselves, and why, and you keep going for more. So let me just say that just to add on to this, because we're already finishing the presentation, I couldn't go without saying that part of what I'm mentioning here is what we teach at the museum, is what we show at the museum. So hopefully you'll be able to come here and discover through the gate of ancient Peru, through Museo Larco, and its beautiful gardens too, and enjoy the experience in itself. So hopefully this was a good introduction for you to understand a little bit about ancient Peru. and the way that they had of seeing the world. And hopefully you'll come here so you can experience it in the flesh. So thank you very, very much for listening to me, and thank you, Annalise, for having me. Because it was about ancient expressions of the bond with nature. I think it's very important to say that there's a lot that we're not saying. I mean, Annalise, you've been here long enough to know that this really was an introduction. But it's also quite nice to understand that this is a thing that it's not including only Peru, but people will see some similarities with other ancient civilizations. It's not like it's not that they were linked at the beginning or anything, but it really is that connection with nature that has shaped their worldview. And you can see the similarities in some expressions, right? Whether we're talking about Egypt or China or Peru.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we want to let people know as well that Peru is open for visitors again. We are soon going to have a group again. So, yeah, our doors are wide open and the museum is renovated. I heard. Samantha, can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, oh, it's a yeah. Okay, I can. I Well, we are starting to, we're finishing renovating. We've been away for a year fully because of the whole situation here in Peru. But now, just last night, we announced that the cafe, the restaurant that is inside, I haven't mentioned the cafe restaurant. I do have to mention that, which is beautiful. And it's going to open on May 7th. And we're hoping for the museum to open soon because we, instead of just, working from outside, we're working from home right now, but the museum has been getting some renovations. So we've taken advantage of the time that we've been closed in order to expand a little bit of the erotic gallery. And that's going to be huge. And that's all I really can say because people have to see it on their own so they can understand just like how big this is and to have a full experience really of discovering Peru just with a whole day at the museum and finishing it off with like a lunch or a dinner at the cafe. That would be great.
Yeah, and the food is great. I remember. I have one question here. Um, it's how do the Inca cultures like connect through the Inca culture? I think what they mean
Oh,
is like, yeah.
yeah, that's a good question. I didn't mention that. So, ancient Peruvian cultures, they're quite wide. It's a big variety of ancient cultures. So we have different regions that were the centers of very little cultures that existed throughout the thousands of years. So of course, not all of them connect to the Incan cultures, but regionally, for example, in the north, you have a full line of cultures that evolve. We just give them different names, but they just evolve into different cultures that by the end of I mean, by the 1400s, when the Incas were starting to take over the rest of the Peruvian um, of Peru's zone, let's say that the limits that we now say that it's Peru, they started to conquer all of the different regions, and so they encountered other cultures that ended up that they actually took in. I always like to say that the Incas are kind of like the Romans in that sense that they didn't really destroy the cultures or the civilizations or the towns that existed before them. They took them in through bargains, through conquering, but whatever they were good at, they implemented it in their empire. So that actually made it stronger and made it wider. That's why it expands so much. It's one of the biggest empires that existed. So, but it's a very smart way of doing that. So cultures, basically, to sum it up, cultures are separated. They interacted with each other along the time until the Incas showed up and ended up conquering them and taking them into their empire.
Great. Another question we got is what the significance of the handles that in the pottery that were shown?
Okay, that's a long that's a long question, and it's something I can only get into in short, because there are two different handles specifically that we have in our collection. Now, just a little side note that the collection is mostly about the coast. We do have other cultures, but in the coast, there were two very differentiated styles in the north and in the south. So in the north, you have most of the bottles that I showed, the pottery vessels, they have that sort of handle. And in the south, you have a different style of handle. So it's not the only handle that we have. It's just the one that we like to show most because it's a specific culture. The cultures from the north were very graphic. So it's they always present good examples that I can use to teach people about Peruvian cosmovision. But that handle specifically has a lot of debate. So I'm just going to present it so people can see what I'm talking about. Maybe I should just do that as opposed to just saying that. Yeah, so it's this handle that people are mentioning, right?
Yeah.
And it's this handle. So that handle, it can have a lot of explanations. Of course, we will probably never know for sure, because that's the pain of archaeology. We can never know for sure. And there weren't any written testaments to why that was. But one of the most common theories, let's say hypothesis that we have, is that it has to do with duality. So these are vessels that you can actually pour liquid in. And once the liquid is in, the air that is its opposing element, it's going to go out. And it's just one entrance for both of them. So once the water comes in, the air will flow out. And that's basically the explanation. There are other explanations. You could say that the vessel in itself is kind of like the ucupacha because it can be wet, it's filled with liquid, just like the earth. And then you have the link among it and the not really the entrance, but the union of those two between the mouth and the spout and the vessel itself. But yeah, it's up to debate, really.
I also remember seeing one where the guide explained me that when you moved it and it has like two pipes and they make music, or like they make
Yeah, those are beautiful. So those are the whistlers. They're whistle vessels. So there are some specific ones that have little they have they kind of have like the holes in the middle of the vessel so they can make different sounds. And it's really interesting because it exists from like the earliest cultures, and they really do make different sounds. So they had a very a deep sense of artistry and of music and music techniques in order to make different sounds and make it even sound like specific animals, which is something that we haven't talked about. But they do have vessels that whistle like a bird, or you can sounds like a snake. So we have those sacred animals that we've talked about in the presentation represented also in sounds.
That's really fascinating. We have another question here that where someone asks about, are there representations of natural medicines in those cultures or in the pottery that you have?
There is application of medicine. The one that I can always say, because it's the one that everyone knows, it's the cranial turbinations, which is something that is still sort of applied to modern medicine. Because when the brain gets swollen, whether it's because of a battle wound in those times or any kind of brain injury, you have to lower the pressure of what the brain is doing. So they used to put a hole in the skull, which is not that nice because, now nothing existed like anesthesia that could help, with the pain. But and we also have some of those objects at the museum. We have a skull that has a sign signs that the person was actually recovering, because the bone that was taken off during the surgery was actually growing back. So it's really, really interesting that such a thing existed, and it's still sort of applied today, and it worked. Of course, other than that, there are some medicinal, there are even representations of scenes. We haven't mentioned that there are some cultures that represent scenes from the daily life, like agricultures or fishermen, or really how do you call them? Like the not nurses, but the people who did the medicine back then, right? The curanderos, or just very, very specific scenes from daily life or specific jobs that were represented. So we're able to know that that existed. And of course, through tradition, you also know there are still some towns and there are still some regions that still apply very specific plans and very specific objects that will help you cure certain diseases, which we're still finding out now, because we still don't know much of our rainforest, and we still don't know much about the very, very diverse species that we have in Peru. So that's something to be excited about, right? What will come up next?
Someone asks, what, as an archaeologist, for its significance, is your favorite piece in the museum?
That's a terrible question. No, I'm kidding. It's such a tough question to answer. I mean, as an archaeologist, I don't know. Wow, that's tough. It's like asking me what my favorite child is. But there is a piece that I absolutely love that I haven't put it in the presentation, because it's just, I would go on for an hour about that piece. But it's a Nazca piece. So Nazca is a culture from the southern coast, where the Nazca lines are. It's a very, very pretty drum. It's a drum made out of pottery, and when you flip it upside down, you will see what we think is a priest of the Nazca culture, and it has very strong symbols that he connected through the San Pedro cactus, that is a natural hallucinogen. Because it has the stars, that is the type of the cut that San Pedro has. When you cut the San Pedro, it's kind of shaped like a star. So he has the stars on his cheeks, and he has the representations of all of the animals, of the sacred animals, just representing the union of the snake and the bird and the feline. And to have that in a musical object that you just know, because music is present in every civilization, right? We all have traditions. We still have songs up to now that represent specific traditions, religious traditions, or just traditions in general. It's very important to societies, to humans, to interact with music and to have that full representation in a musical object, just like the whistling vessels, right? It's just, to me, is one of the most beautiful things, because I'm very into music, so I love that process of having all of that represented in just one thing.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Yeah, what I also want to share with people here is, like, I, personally, I am fascinated living here in Peru, and like seeing that, like, archaeology and objects from the past, they're like so present everywhere, because there is so much, and like people find things all the time, and you can have it, people have them in their houses, in the shops, like they're just everywhere. You can have them in your house, because in the museums there's often no space for everything, no? And so you cannot take them obviously out of the country, but people have them in their houses, no? And I think that's really great. Some people just go on Sundays to see if they can find something, no, in some places in Peru, which is kind of interesting, no? um I don't know, do you maybe I think we can wrap it up, and because there's no more questions for now. So thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you for everybody watching. We will have more webinars coming up. We will keep you informed about that. Is there a final message that you would like to give to the people?
Again, this is just such a small introduction. As you said, there's so much to see. A trip, I don't think is enough to see really how wonderful it is to be here. Not just historically, you've seen that it's all linked to culture itself, and it's just a wonderful place to visit. So, yeah, I invite you all to come to Peru and explore it for yourself, and hopefully we'll see you here.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, we are waiting for you with open arms to welcome you here. Peru is it has a lot of history, archaeology, and there's so much even more. There's amazing food and a lot of biodiversity. It's a country where you can pretty much find everything, I think. So we'll be here for you. Thank you. Bye
Thank
bye.
you.